For.
Councillor Stewart.
Against.
Councillor Walker.
Against.
Councillor Watson.
Against.
Councillor Young.
For.
So that is carried 15 votes to 5 with 1 abstention.
Thank you very much, councillors, and thank you, Sandra, for conducting the vote. We come now to item number 10, which is the decision on the proposed new freedom camping in the vehicle bylaw. And can I just, if I can ask maybe Councillor Cooper to move this recommendation and yes, Councillor Dalton, who is also on the panel, to second it. Are you happy to do that, Councillor Dalton?
Yes, thank you.
And I can see IMSB member Wilcox, so I want to thank you for your participation alongside Angela and Linda in the extensive work you've done on that. I just really can't express my appreciation sufficiently for the hours of work that the bylaws hearing panel has put in on this and on other issues. And a big thank you on behalf of all of the councillors here. We have in attendance a range of officers headed by Paul Wilson, but to introduce the item, I would like to invite the chair of the hearings panel, Councillor Linda Cooper, to speak to it, and then I'll invite Paul Wilson to add any other further comments as appropriate, and then we'll open it up for questions. Councillor Cooper, please.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and I'd ask you to bear with on this because it's 6 years of work actually, the culmination of 6 years of work, many staff, many people listening to hearings and collating submissions. So this report presents the bylaw panel recommendations on public feedback and local board views on the proposed new Freedom Camping and Vehicles Bylaw 2022. I chaired the panel alongside very able members, Councillor Angela Dalton and IMSB Statutory Board member, IMSB member Glenn Wilcox. This proposal was developed in response to the concerns about a previous proposal, which members will recall was set aside in 2019. Notably, this proposal removed all reserves from the scope of the bylaw, and that was because the Reserves Act changed, so people could be fined if they breached the law about camping on reserves. It included general rules, different to the last one, we didn't have one, developed by a joint political working group to set basic requirements for freedom camping everywhere in Auckland, and reiterated that the bylaw is not intended to manage homelessness. We adopted the proposal as a governing body in September last year for public consultation and promoted the consultation in all local newspapers, Auckland and social media. We also sent email notifications to stakeholders, including mana whenua, and to submitters on the previous proposal. People had the opportunity to feedback in a variety of ways, including at virtual Zoom conferences, through online forms, email, post and phone, from the 26th of October to the 5th of December 2021. And as the public consultation ran during Auckland's COVID-19 lockdown, no in-person events were able to be held. A separate research survey was also conducted to gather additional views from a representative sample of Aucklanders. More than 1,600 people and organisations gave feedback to the consultation, and more than 1,900 Aucklanders participated in the research survey. 20 local boards provided their views on how the panel should address matters raised in public feedback, with 12 presenting their views to the panel in April. Overall, the key proposals we put forward were supported by a majority of the public and local boards, noting that where there were mixed views on specific general rules, the proposal was the most preferred of all the alternatives. And where designated areas did not have majority support, the public preference was usually to have fewer restrictions, not more. The panel, after considering all the feedback and deliberations in April and May, recommends some changes to the proposal, adding 13 additional prohibited areas, 2 due to an increase risk of flash flooding, and 11 areas which provided car parking for reserves that were assessed and recommended for prohibition in the earlier proposal we consulted on. Reclassifying 2 proposed restricted areas as prohibited to better protect public access to those places, and reducing the maximum vehicle limit at 1 restricted area, and changes to the bylaw text to make the rules more certain to campers and the public. We do not recommend making other changes requested in feedback. For example, we do not recommend loosening the rules in some areas as requested, because we consider they justify protection and the proposed rules were appropriate. We do not recommend making stricter general rules or prohibiting large areas, because there wasn't evidence to support such broad brush rules as a proportionate response to the problem. We think the bylaw as recommended by the panel is the most appropriate response to the problems freedom camping can cause. It will enable responsible freedom camping to take place in Auckland while protecting our environment, public health and safety, and public access for everyone, as required by the Freedom Camping Act. We're only allowed by that. Our legal team have reviewed the recommended changes and are confident that it aligns with the Council's obligations under the Freedom Camping Act, and we ask that the governing body approve the recommendations. And I do want to remind councillors that the current bylaw, any of the bylaws that currently give us some sort of control over freedom camping, will all expire in October this year. And if not replaced, freedom camping will be allowed unregulated in most places in Auckland until we adopt a new bylaw. So contrary to some of the public conversation that this bylaw would create a free-for-all, believe me, no regulation would be the real free-for-all. This actually applies restrictions, especially the on-road parts of the bylaw, the general rule. I would sincerely like to thank Councillor Dalton and IMSB member Wilcox. It was a pleasure to work with you. And also like to thank our staff, and particularly our manager Paul, but Rebecca Foreman, who's done the bulk of this work, and Bailey Vile. Also the compliance staff that sat with us on the deliberations panel to inform us. Really, you know, we have a high level of professionalism with our staff, and even though some of the feedback was quite emotive, they kept us, and our legal staff, Katie Bexley, kept us on track to do this within the law, and to manage any risk around legal challenge. So thank you very much. I'll hand over to staff. Back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Cooper, and welcome Paul and Rebecca to the table. Paul, is there anything you'd like to add to Councillor Cooper's comments?
No, nothing further to add, Your Worship. Happy to answer questions.
Okay, that's great. Well, look, let's leap straight into questions. We've had this issue around the table for a very long time. We've debated it one way or the other way, and we've had legal advice, and we've consulted many times on it. So it may be, and as Councillor Cooper said, it's not just maybe, that it's time to make a decision. If we don't make a decision today, we will leave a vacuum by October, and there'll be no rules regarding freedom camping. So we need to make this decision today. So, first question is from Councillor Desley Simpson. Councillor Simpson.
Thanks, Mayor, and thanks, Linda and team, for all your work. Angela, Glenn, everybody. It has been a long time coming. Look, I've just got a few quick questions. I think certified vans is a really good idea for inclusion in general rules. But my question around that is around the government, again, she says, because the government are yet to bring in their new rules for the certification process, which was included in their proposal from MB. So no legislation has been brought in. How will Council ensure that the vans really are certified and meet the rules for self-contained? So what's the process and how robust will that be?
Paul, I think that's probably to you.
But to Rebecca to answer that one, thank you.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. So there is currently a national standard that defines what makes a vehicle self-contained, and that's the process against which they are currently certified. There are various ways that a vehicle has to have a certificate to show they've been certified. They have to display a blue sticker, and that's what our staff on the ground are looking for at the moment. That national standard will continue to be the industry benchmark until it is replaced in some way by central government. That probably will be incorporated into the Act itself, but until then, certification under that standard will continue to apply. I'm happy if the licensing and compliance staff we have wanted to comment specifically on anything on the ground that occurs, but currently they look for those certificates and those blue stickers. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Back to you,
Thank
Councillor
you.
Simpson.
Yeah, thanks. So now I'm looking from council's perspective on policing of the new general rules. So what are we doing? What's the monitoring and policing of that? How can we give Aucklanders our commitment that by bringing in these rules, we've got the rules, how can we give Auckland confirmation that we can actually police them? Have we got the resources to police them?
Rebecca.
Through you, Mr Chair, I'll probably ask James Hassel from Licensing and Compliance to discuss their approach to enforcement. James, I believe you're with us online.
James, have we got you online?
You sure have.
Yep, we can see you. Go ahead, please.
Good afternoon, councillors. So my team have been working closely with the policy team to ensure that what's being proposed today is able to be enforced. In broad terms, what we're anticipating is engaging contractors in the same way that we do for noise control, to ensure that we have the coverage available as and when it's required. They'll be looking primarily at what's to be enforced under the Freedom Camping bylaw, but if there are any related camping issues, then they'll be able to deal with those at the same time.
Okay, thanks for that. Look, I know this has to be evidence-based, so there was a suggestion at one stage that in the online complaints process that council have a separate heading for freedom camping, like there is for noise, but I don't think that's been taken any further. Are we going to do anything around that? Do you know?
Through you, Mr Chair, I think that's another question for Licensing and Compliance.
So, James, we've still got you there.
Yep, still here. Sorry, I don't have those details, but it does make absolute sense to have a separate place to record that, Councillor Simpson.
Oh, thank you. That's really great, James. Thanks. And I just wondered, is there a commitment to review the list of sites with feedback from local boards over the next sort of 18 months or 2 summers to ensure that the bylaw remains fit for purpose?
James, I think to you again.
It's not his,
no,
his
it's to
role.
Rebecca.
Yeah.
Okay.
Through you, Mr Chair. So you'll recall that the governing body did pass a resolution in September to consider other areas that were identified in consultation if the legislative criteria were met, and those would be considered following the adoption of the bylaw. However, the panel considered public feedback and determined that the criteria were not met for the majority of the areas that had been raised in feedback, and those areas have not been put into the bylaw as prohibited. And as far as a future review is concerned, that will be at the direction of the regulatory committee to decide how they want to proceed. Council will be monitoring the effectiveness of the bylaw at preventing and managing freedom camping impacts and report findings to that committee, and the committee will decide what and when it wishes to initiate in terms of further work. Thank you.
Okay, how often is that feedback? Is it annually or after the summer to regulatory?
So, Madam Chair, through you, Mr Chair, the normal bylaw review is 5 yearly. But at the same time, if there was enough negative feedback or maybe feedback saying, look, we don't have enough spaces or something like that, there's an opportunity to do that earlier. And that's something we'll just keep an eye on that at the regulatory committee if I'm still on it, and if I'm still here. But that will be highlighted. That can go in the work plan if necessary.
Oh, thank you, councillor. And look, just the last one. Sorry, it's the last one. It's a little bit more local. My local board met for one night. What's the risk around trying to drop this down for one night as opposed to 2 nights in the same street?
Rebecca.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So the bylaw panel did look at all the feedback that was received, including from your constituents' councillor. They did look at all of the feedback around whether one night was more appropriate, and they have settled on 2 nights being the most appropriate approach there. One of the reasons being that obviously these general rules will cover all of Auckland, and these are areas which are not necessarily known to be likely to be popular with freedom campers, and therefore 1 night would be 2 nights would be a more appropriate response, more proportionate response to any issues that arise in those areas. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Councillor. Councillor Greg Sayers.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. I guess one of the question I'd like to ask is around the potential for somebody to have a certified freedom camping, setup and just stay in the same area. So that under this bylaw, it seems that they could circulate in one area and just stay there. Like most freedom campers are actually on holiday. They're out there and they're going away with their family, or they're overseas visitors, and they've got one of these vehicles, and they're actually really enjoying themselves and being very responsible. But there is potential for somebody to own one of these vehicles permanently, 365 days a year, and perhaps just stay in the same area and circulate and freedom camp in one localized area. Now, whether that causes any type of grief or concerns to locals, I don't know. But I guess my question through you, Mr. Chair, would be just to fully understand the ability for compliance to look at potential issues that people might raise around that type of behaviour, which probably is an unintended consequence rather than an intended one.
Rebecca.
So through you, Mr Mayor, just to clarify the question, you're saying about how the compliance would respond to that situation? In which case...
Yeah, the options they have, I guess, yeah.
So I'd probably pass that over to James Hassel again, Mr Mayor.
As with all compliance issues, there are always the outliers that are challenging to deal with. And if a particular person or persons are repeatedly breaking the bylaw in different parts of Auckland, then we'd look to take stronger action against them above and beyond the $200 infringement fee which is available. If they're staying in each spot for less than the 2-day period, that will be challenging though.
Yes, I understand. I think that's probably one of the fears that I'm picking up from feedback, James. So thank you for your answer there. The other one, Mr. Mayor, probably another thing that people might be a bit concerned about is how are we going to promote this? At the moment, it could be potentially promoted by ourselves to be, we've opened up the streets for freedom camping. You can circulate where every 7 days, is it? I think it works out about 7 days, something like that. But we actually have a number of designated sites. I think there's 20 really good sites that we could promote to the freedom camping audience, industry, income, all those positive things that come from freedom camping. So I don't know if there's anyone online through you, Chair, that could comment about how we might be promoting this freedom camping bylaw in a positive way and directing people towards those areas where we actually have the size and the facilities to cope for freedom campers.
Okay, so how do we get the message out there to the wider public once we've passed the bylaw and what it means? Rebecca.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So after the bylaw is adopted, obviously it doesn't become operational until the 1st of September, so we have got a little bit of time to prepare in terms of the communications that will go out, the information that will be available on the website, and certainly there will be a full list of all the areas where freedom camping isn't allowed, but there'll also be a full explanation of the rules that apply. We can also provide links to other information that might be of use to freedom campers wanting to visit Auckland, and certainly we'll look at all the options for how we might promote other places that may be of interest to them. And just to clarify, Councillor, it is actually 2 weeks is the non-return period. I think you mentioned a period of 7 days there. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Councillor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councillor John Watson.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor. 2 questions, one to James on enforcement and then one to one of the bylaw officers. James, at point 14, we're told about the decision to exclude land held under the Reserves Act. In terms of practical enforcement, and you mentioned this $200 infringement fee, am I right in assuming that as far as the Freedom Camping and Vehicles bylaw, that infringement fee can be imposed, straight away to anyone that infringes the bylaw, and that in respect of the Reserve Act, there is a similar capacity to do the same. Am I right in assuming that?
That's right. My understanding is that there is an infringement notice regime under both of those acts, the Freedom Camping Act and the Reserves Act now, which enables a very fast enforcement response.
Great, that's good to hear. And the follow-up question to the bylaw officers is that in respect of our recommendations, and I think some other councillor asked about the general areas rules in terms of that 2 nights as opposed to 1 night. So in our recommendations, I guess that would come under the notion of what's been deemed most appropriate and proportionate. We had a choice there, but that's been deemed the most appropriate and proportionate in terms of our recommendations.
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, that's correct.
Okay, all right. Thanks. I reserve the right to speak on this one, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Papacoon.
Oh, thanks, Mayor. I really want to ask my pātai so I can mihi to the panel and the whole team for their tremendous work, and I really do appreciate, the amount of work that goes into this over a really long period of time. So thank you. But I do have a little question as well. It might be a little bit niche, but I know with Waiheke, there was, a lot of concern about the fact that there's no waste drop-off, and I can see that a lot of consideration has gone into that, and I think it's at page 244. There's some quite detailed amendments that go to Waiheke. And I think that the issue there was that there wasn't any evidence of harm to be able to say that there could be no freedom camping on Waiheke, if I remember correctly. But I just wanted to understand, is there any situation where a freedom camper can separate their dumping waste from their actual vehicle? I mean, is that kind of hypothetically possible? This is really kind of reflecting my lack of knowledge around, I'm not a freedom camper or a van camper. I prefer under canvas in a dock campsite, but would someone potentially have a vehicle that they would have on Waiheke and have to actually leave the island other than by taking their vehicle, and that this might sort of create other issues?
Right. I'll give you the go at that one, Rebecca, or to refer it to somebody that might know the answer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to clarify the question, Councillor, you're saying, can they dispose of their waste without taking the vehicle with them to dispose of the waste? So can they actually remove the waste from the vehicle and travel away with it? Is that?
Yeah. Would that ever happen?
Well, I understand many of the vehicles do have cassettes, which are what fill with waste and then are removed, but I don't believe they're designed to be taken much of a distance from the vehicle. They would normally be disposed immediately from the vehicle into the dump station, but to be honest, that's probably at a level of technical specificity I can't speak to, I'm afraid. I'm not sure if James might have any further information, but if you're thinking of people taking waste on the ferry, for example, on foot, I can't imagine that would
Well,
be
I
a goer,
think
but
the way, yeah,
yeah.
I understand. I mean, the way the bylaw's written, it's very clear that you actually have to leave Waiheke with your vehicle, and must be away from the island for at least 2 weeks before you can come back. But I guess I'm sort of like thinking about the scenario where people would say, well, actually, my vehicle stays on Waiheke. I can find a different way to dispose of the waste. And so it just might create another compliance issue. But what I'm also hearing is that compliance is going to be something that there's going to be a focus. So, yeah, like I say, it is quite a niche, a hypothetical query. But I do just want to kind of thank the team for the work that's gone into it, the whole Rebecca and everybody. So yeah, if there's not really an answer to that, I'm happy to leave it.
Yeah, thanks, Pippa. It's conjuring up all sorts of images that probably we don't want just before lunch at the moment, actually.
Sorry, I should have gone there.
It might be that you could pursue that question offline with somebody that has particular expertise on it.
Could Google it.
So, so somebody suggested Googling it. Right, Councillor Hills is my last question.
Kia ora. Thank you, and thank you to everyone who's worked on this for feels like 100 years. I guess for me, the questions are just on the infringement, right? So right now, what and how is our current bylaws enforced? If someone parked on the road or near or in our reserves, what happens to them under the current rules?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think that would be another question for James. Thank you.
We're coming back to that curly question again, Councillor Hills. As is mentioned in the documentation around this particular report, there is a range of other rules and bylaws which apply to camping more generally. Unfortunately, our enforcement powers under the bylaws aren't as strong as we'd like them to be, so there's no general infringement regime under our bylaws, which makes enforcement hard. But we take the graduated enforcement approach, which has been well publicised, where we try to educate people, ask them to move on, and escalate from there.
So right now, if someone parked on my street, Freedom Camping, we can't fine them $200. But once this bylaw's in place, we could fine them $200 if we felt we needed to.
That's my understanding.
Thank you. If we voted this down completely, essentially the whole thing would lapse and we couldn't even prosecute from October.
Yeah, so we can still prosecute, but again, as has been traversed previously, the prosecution process is or can be long-winded. It doesn't give us the immediate enforcement tool to discourage the camping, not to mention the expense of taking court proceedings and the likelihood of a very low fine being awarded.
Okay, I'll just ask Rebecca to comment further on that question just before you.
In your opinion, the general.
Sorry, I was just going to get Rebecca to comment further on your question, Councillor Hills.
Just to clarify, Councillor Hills.
Really poor, sorry.
No problem. In October, the current bylaws will lapse, and therefore there would be no regulation of freedom camping, and therefore nothing to prosecute under in this case. The other bylaws, such as public safety and nuisance, would still be there. The Reserves Act would still be there, but in terms of a specific freedom camping bylaw, there would be nothing, and therefore no way to take action under the current one. It would need to be replaced.
Back to you, Councillor Hills.
So, on your professional opinion. So in your opinion, the general rules, especially for streets, are actually more prohibitive than now. That even though it seems like we're giving the ability to camp everywhere, but actually the enforcement powers mean that it's not strong.
I'm not sure that I understood the question through you, Mr. Chair, but just to be clear, Council is not allowing freedom camping through this bylaw. The government has passed an act that allows freedom camping in Auckland. So what this bylaw does is actually introduce restrictions rather than allow it in the first place. That is already the case under the legislation. What the general rules do is ensure that rather anybody being able to park, for example, on your street for as long as they like and whatever vehicle they like, this would actually introduce those restrictions, such as certified self-contained vehicles, a 2-night stay. So at the moment, it is prohibited in all those places, but that is not something that can continue under the in a bylaw made under the Act. Hope that clarifies for you. Thank you.
So I think the answer is that this brings in more restrictions and also an infringement power to enable those restrictions to be properly enforced in a way that we haven't been able to do before.
Yes. On the 4-week turnaround, 2 weeks, sorry, could I just have an explanation of why 2 weeks was chosen over 4? I know my 2 local boards suggested 4, and there was mixed feedback on that. Was there a strong reason why it couldn't be 4?
I think maybe it's better for me to speak because it was a panel decision, guided by the. A lot of this is around the fact that you can get really good economic benefits for local areas when you have visitors, and somebody might be in a place travelling around, but on the way back they want to stay again. And if it's 4 weeks, they can't do that, but they might really want to go back to that cafe or wherever they were going and spend some more money in that area. And it was about trying to allow, because this freedom camping thing isn't just about stopping everything. It's actually about trying to manage the effects of a kind of a tourism, really. So we felt that at least 2 weeks gave people a chance, maybe at the beginning of the school holidays, they stayed somewhere on the way back, they could stay there again, just for 1 or 2 nights and then go. But 4 weeks seemed like it prohibited people from ever being in that place again, and it might actually take away from that economic opportunity for that community.
Thank you. And the last question, and it was based on Kaipātiki local board feedback. We were told that we couldn't consider their longer list of places such as parts of roads and outside schools. Why was that still not able to be incorporated? What I understand that the evidence was there was no evidence to do it, but could that be explained a bit, just to clarify?
Maybe Rebecca, and then if there's a legal thing.
So through you, Mr. Chair, what Kaipātiki were asking were for areas to be effectively prohibited, in particular based on certain characteristics. That would mean that there were massive numbers of areas which had those characteristics, which would all be covered by the same prohibition. In order to make a prohibition, we have to have evidence that it is a proportionate response to the problem occurring in those areas. Doing a category-based prohibition is very broad brush. It would effectively say that every area, for example, outside a shop, is subject to the same demand, the same impact, and all must be treated in the same way. So the advice that was given was that putting in place a prohibition for areas by category in that way would be unlikely to meet the tests required of us in the Act. Where individual areas do have problems, and that we had evidence that that was the case, then they could be subject to an individual prohibition or restriction as appropriate. There's also the risk of, if you're putting in restrictions based on a category, let's say, for example, outside a community facility, a lot of freedom campers are actually visitors from outside Auckland. It would be very important that they could actually determine they were in fact outside one of the sorts of places that they couldn't be. Sometimes they'll be arriving in the dark, places aren't signposted. So although sometimes hypothetically it might sound doable, in terms of practical application, huge number of areas, huge variety in the current demand for staying at those places, the kinds of impacts that would be posed, and so on. So the panel did consider the feedback from Kaipātiki Local Board and from residents as well, who may have raised similar issues. Having considered all of that, looking at the requirements under the Act, they didn't determine that they were able to proceed with such a prohibition, and that's where they've landed. I hope that provides some additional reasoning for you. Thank you.
Thank you. I notice Independent Maori Statutory Board member Glenn Wilcox, you had your hand up. Glenn, is there a comment you wanted to make in relation to that?
Oh, not in relation to that question, Your Honour. Your Worship, I just wanted to just make a comment in relation to this decision that the governing body are making, if that's okay with you.
Okay, look, you're very faint, Glenn, but can I come back to you? We're just about to move into comments now, and I might recognise you first. If you can turn your volume up. There are no further questions, so we'll move to comments. And the first comment is through Glenn Wilcox. Glenn.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Your Worship. Sorry. I've been involved with this Freedom Camping Act now since it first came before the Regulatory Committee under former under Des Morrison, the former councillor for Franklin. At that time, when it first came, we only saw this as this was really not an Auckland issue. This was a Queenstown Lakes problem. Since then, of course, we've had the homelessness issue, and that created a lot of issues with people camping all over the city. And then we've had the COVID issue where we had to try and get these people into places to live. And now we're facing what's basically the fuel price issue, where a lot of people now will not be traveling very far. So I think, this is a very dynamic area, this freedom camping. It's definitely hasn't been the panel's intention to prevent people from freedom camping, but just to control it. But as I said just then, the main thing, and I'd like councillors to remember this, is that this is a very dynamic area of New Zealand life, and it could change in another couple of years again. Just the fuel prices alone, I'm struggling to fill my own car up, let alone I'd hate to think what it's cost to fill up one of those self-contained vehicles. So I'd just like to leave that with you and thank the panel members and the other panel members and the officers that work with us. Thank you.
Kia ora, Glenn. Thank you very much, and thank you for your work on that. The next comment is Councillor Desley Simpson.
Thanks, Mayor. Look, again, I just want to say thank you to the team. It seems like we've been discussing this forever. I think it's ended up in a better place than it has been, so congratulations on that. Look, I think the key points for me is it needs careful monitoring and it needs an easy reporting function, and I took heart from what James Hassel said around that, and I look forward to working with that. The compliance and the team able to support that compliance, I think, will be key as well. So look, I just think it's better than it's been. I appreciate all the work that's been. I look forward to the ongoing monitoring, and if it needs any further tweaking in the future, so be it. But I think we absolutely need something before October, and I just thank everyone for getting us to this place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor John Watson.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor. I'm also hopeful that the measures that we're approving here today will address a number of these ongoing issues. Certainly in the ward I represent, freedom camping has been a big concern for a number of years now. And in that respect, both with regards to the freedom camping in vehicles bylaw and the provisions under the Reserve Act, and not least of which is the ability to issue immediate infringements, I hope will go some way to addressing a situation that in some respects it has got worse over the last few years. So in the last few years, in a number of locations around the Hibiscus Coast and the East Coast Bays, we've had significant numbers of people turning up and either just camping for large periods of time on public reserves or in places in vehicle, not so much self-contained vehicles, but vehicles adjacent, and that's caused a real challenge for our compliance officers, but also for the council's credibility. A number of these groups that are coming up, they're not poor people. They're turning up in big SUVs with jet skis and sophisticated cooking equipment, and just really taking advantage of the area, and often it's a beach area where there's a lot of people on the go, and really just abusing the public reserve. So hopefully nipping that sort of behaviour in the bud, whether it's on a reserve or whether it's in areas covered by the general rules, will stop that, because it's undesirable. Obviously, the word's getting out, and people are becoming even more brazen, and it's it's a problem that's escalating. So let's hope some appropriate enforcement with the use of the infringement fines will go some way to stopping what is basically antisocial behaviour. In terms of the general rules, and I think particularly as it goes to appropriateness and proportionality, I know a number of other councillors certainly did question the provision that went to allowing freedom campers to stay a maximum of 2 nights in the same road or off-road parking area. We concede that the government legislation doesn't give us an option here, but in terms of appropriateness, I would have much preferred that to be 1 night. I think in terms of the reality of difficulties with compliance and enforcement, that 1 night would have made things very clear. And the best enforcers often are members of the public, not least of which are people that may or have vehicles parking outside their house. So if it's 1 night and they're out by 9 a.m. in the morning, then it's very clear what the expectation is. 2 nights can easily drift into 3 or 4, and then by the time a stretched compliance team get to it in terms of their graduated policing, then someone can be there for quite some significant period of time. So I think that was really an opportunity lost to really be clear and to perhaps redress the imbalance somewhat. Overall, though, as other people have said, it is an improvement. It will come down to compliance, and I just hope that in the first instance there's a realisation that if these sorts of transgressions aren't addressed in a fairly determined fashion, then they do spread, and that's certainly what we've witnessed in the Albany ward, and that's to the detriment of the community as a whole and to the council's reputation. So I'm looking forward to a summer season that is free of those sorts of encampments or abuses of the community that has happened in the past. So thanks to the people that have put in work to bring this to fruition. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Greg Sayers.
Thank you, Your Worship. Good work. This in 2019, I think it was, the bylaw wasn't in such hot shape as it is perhaps today, and just acknowledging the work that's gone on to get us to this point today, Worship. I'm a little bit concerned about the comments from the Independent Maori Statutory Board, because it tends to, in my mind, suggest that fuel prices go up and different things happen. Maybe more people will turn to freedom camping as a way of living. And my understanding through this bylaw, this isn't about addressing homelessness. That's addressed through other policies of Auckland Council, but there seems to be a really unspoken item here that this could well become people's way of life, and that concerns me that we haven't really addressed that, but we can address it going forward, because it may well become a reality, and it got alluded to today. The fact that we haven't gone, my preferred option through you, Chair, has always been the 1 night rather than 2 nights. And I guess just a slight disappointment. A lot of things that I'm very pleased with this bylaw, but just a disappointment around it being limited to a maximum of 2 nights rather than maximum of 1 night. Right at the start of the introduction of this item way back a few months ago, I was very keen for it to be 1 night, because it seemed a little bit more practical. But what we've heard today from my learned colleagues about why they've gone for 2 nights, I don't support that point of view. So those are my comments, Chair. I just would like to highlight to all of us and the staff included about the unintended consequences of, the price increases and the pressures on people to perhaps move to an alternative lifestyle, and that could well involve them buying vehicles that have a blue sticker and living on Auckland streets. And I think that's something that we haven't really comprehensively taken into account this time round. So those are my comments, Mayor. I hope they're helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Josephine Bartley.
Oh, thank you, Your Worship. I just wanted to acknowledge the panel and especially Councillor Cooper for her leadership through all of this. I know in some of our regulatory committees it's been quite frustrating for her because this is a controversial topic, and even in our committee it was hard to get consensus around some of the major issues to do with freedom camping in vehicles bylaws. So I really wanted to acknowledge her leadership here and the panel for doing this work, because I know it was a lot of hours and it's very hard to find willing councillors, IMSB members, to sit on panels with this amount of work. So I really want to acknowledge them. My comments are acknowledging the staff and thanking them for this work. And it has actually been really good to see how the 2016 pilot has been taken on board. And there were a lot of recommendations, a lot of feedback from local boards that have been taken on into consideration in coming up to what we have now. So I really want to acknowledge the staff there. The issues around enforcement, of course, are always going to be important. I mean, some local boards before had to contract their own security to carry out the enforcement in the pilot. So really taking to heart what James is saying in regards to enforcement and in regards to the discretion that officers will use if they do come across rough sleepers and people that are homeless, because this bylaw isn't about that situation. And in terms of what we're hearing regarding fuel, people that were hard up were already doing that anyway. They would drive somewhere where their job is, and then they'd sleep in that particular area, so they didn't have to spend money on petrol to get back home to come back to work again. So it's already happening, and I'm sure they're not going to be considered as freedom campers and infringed for sleeping in their car so that they can go to work because they can't afford the petrol. I also wanted to say that we have beautiful views in our city, all around it. And so, you know, this is a good thing that we're allowing people to have a chance to appreciate and experience our city, but to do so responsibly and respecting the area. So I believe that this is going to put in place some good guidelines to help us deal with that, because some of the behaviour we're hearing is pretty bad. And yeah, the main concern in my area was just that people were safe when they were doing freedom camping, because they were parking up in some areas where we have brawls and antisocial behaviour. So yeah, thank you for this. Again, thanks to the staff.
Thank you very much, Councillor Bartley. I just want to make a couple of very brief comments before passing over to Linda Cooper in reply. Firstly, it's to add to the thanks that others have given to our elected members, to our IMSB member, and to our staff for the huge amount of work that's gone into that. The second thing is the substantive issue is how we balance not unnecessarily restricting people's freedoms. And while I haven't freedom camped in New Zealand, I spent 6 months freedom camping around other countries on my OE, and it was a great way, you know, responsibly to see countries and to get around and to do it within the means that people on restricted incomes have. But we balance that freedom of freedom camping with the freedom of other people to use those same spots so that we're not impeding access or blocking the enjoyment of other people to those facilities, and also the requirements of the locals, so that people don't go there and behave in a way that is damaging to the enjoyment of others or to the environment. The third thing is that in reaching the recommendations that we have, we needed to comply with the Freedom Camping Act 2011. And we know that if you get this wrong, there are people on both sides of the argument that will sue you. You know, either those that want to have absolute control and restrictions on freedom camping, and those such as the Motor Caravan Association that will will seek legal action if you are overly restrictive. And we've seen councils that have been overly restrictive that have had their bylaws overturned. So what we've come up with today is something that our legal advisors believe is legally robust, that it provides the protections that we need within the Freedom Camping Act 2011. And lastly, I just want to say, not passing this would leave that vacuum where there'd be no rules around freedom camping, so we need to do this. But we also need to have access, as we will under these bylaws, to infringement fines rather than prosecutions. Prosecutions are long-winded, they're expensive, and therefore they're ineffectual. Infringements mean that we can take effective compliance action much more easily than without the bylaws that we're passing today, and that will be a big step forward. So thank you to everybody, and now I want to pass across in reply to Councillor Linda Cooper, who chaired the bylaw committee.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I just want to offer Councillor Dalton a comment if she wanted to. If that's okay, sorry.
Yep,
I know it's like nearly
Angela,
lunchtime.
sorry you hadn't indicated, but if you'd like to speak, you're most welcome to.
No, and look, I just really appreciated being part of this. The experience of Councillor Cooper and IMSB member Glenn was just, it was a really good experience. I just want to say that we did spend quite a bit of time talking about compliance and about reporting back and monitoring. So just acknowledging the concerns that I've heard through this item. But no, really enjoyed it. Thanks for the experience.
Thank you very much, Councillor Dalton. Councillor Cooper.
Thank you. So first of all, I just want to go back to what Member Glenn said, because what I heard was the price of petrol will stop people going in vans because they won't be able to fill up a big van and drive around. So I think there's two sides to this of the heavy amount of heavy price of petrol. I think the rails, the legal tracks we needed to stay in were access, so public access to amenities and their properties, environmental impact, and also public health and safety. So really those are the only things that we could measure that would either make something prohibited or leave it open. And that's the really important thing here. And so when we talk about disappointment, I feel disappointed that people, even after 6 years, still do not understand the Act or the parameters within which you can make a bylaw. Because this is not about you not liking something in your street. That's not part of the parameter. Some people don't like someone parking in their street and sleeping, but if they're allowed to do it, they're allowed to do it, as long as they're not breaking any of the rules. So you can't ring up and say, someone's been here for a night and I don't like it. You can't even do that when they've been 2 nights. But if they're causing an absolute nuisance and they're breaking the public safety and nuisance bylaw, of course. And we do rely on the public to report these things. So I can hardly imagine that this is going to escalate people sleeping there night after night after night, because we know our public. They'll say, this person's been there for 2 nights. I know they have because it's outside my house, and they will ring up. And what is really good is that our regulatory compliance team has said, look, we're going to go to a model that we use for noise control using contractors. That has a very, very high response rate because those people work 24 hours, whereas our compliance staff don't so much, and we can't expect them to work all day and all night. So I think we'll have a really good response rate, but I think it behooves us as elected members to actually educate our public that this is not about not liking it in your street. It's about if it's causing a problem and they're breaking the rules. And I think it's really bad form if any elected member around this table or a local board says, oh, if you don't like it, we don't like it, we don't want it in our area. You know, that's not okay, because that's not what we're doing here. We're actually making sure that we follow the law, which is very permissive, and by putting in the bylaw, we're putting some parameters around it that everybody wanted. And I think we've come to that middle ground where hopefully we won't get a legal challenge. Hopefully we'll have everybody slightly grumpy, but not grumpy enough to take us to court. And the people that want to camp and want to visit our region and spend money in our area can feel they can do that, and that it's reasonable. And that's why we also didn't have to get out at 8 o'clock, because if you were staying in a hotel, you wouldn't have to get out at 8 o'clock. So let's make it a holiday for people, but make sure that they follow the rules, we have good compliance, and we can put this to bed, and also make sure that we have, we're not left in a position after October of people being able to sleep on your street indefinitely. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Cooper. That now brings us to a vote on the recommendations. So I'll do that on voices. All those in favour, please say aye.
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 To the contrary, no. I declare that carried.
I better do it. It's on now. Hang on. Okay.
Sorry, I declare that carried unanimously.
Mr. Mayor,
sorry,
could you please
sorry,
record my
Worship,
vote against
I just want
B2?
to register my vote against B2. That's
Okay,
Councillor
so
Sayers.
I heard no votes against, but I will now record the votes of Councillor Watson, Councillor Sayers and Councillor Stewart against, and Councillor Walker against its recommendation B2, is it? Okay, B2. Okay.
So does that mean they're happy to revoke the other bylaw but have nothing?
Sorry, I can't take further debate on that. Yep, there's a heckler in our audience here. Right, look, we're about to break for lunch, but I just want to acknowledge that passing this bylaw brings to an end the 5-year bylaw review program that ran from 2017 to 2022. And I want to acknowledge that those that have done this work have reviewed 21 Auckland Council bylaws to protect public health and safety, to protect the public from nuisance, to manage the shared use of our public places, and to protect our infrastructure. And in combination, this has been a massive job. So I want to acknowledge again and place formally on record my thanks to the Chair of the Regulatory Committee, Councillor Linda Cooper, and to all of our committee members who have participated in those panels, Angela most recently on the Freedom Camping bylaw. I want to acknowledge the IMSB, and in particular IMSB member Glenn Wilcox, who's been an absolute Trojan in accepting that workload. And last but certainly not least, I want to acknowledge all of the staff, most particularly Auckland Council, but also our CCOs who have collaborated in these exercises, and in particular the staff from the Community and Social Policy Regulatory Practice team. This has been a fantastic job, but just to prove that the Regulatory Committee never sleeps, they've now, from March of this year, initiated their next round of reviews from 2022 to 2025. And I hope, Councillor Cooper, that you'll be there to undertake that workload and to chair it. So a big thanks to everybody that's been involved in this program, which has been to the benefit of our city. And sometimes the work of those people aren't seen, and sometimes that work is not appreciated. But this is to say that all of us around here appreciate that work and absolutely acknowledge what you've achieved. At this point, councillors, I recommend that we break for lunch. It's now 12:50, so I suggest we come back at 1:20. We still have some pretty meaty items on the agenda.